Welcome everybody. My name is Jade and I'm a director of Portrush Heritage Group. We welcome everybody, whether watching from here, near or far, and thank you all very much for your attendance this evening. We would appreciate it if our Zoom audience could please leave their cameras switched off and their sound muted. We are delighted to have you with us this evening and we thank you all for your support. I would like to extend a very special welcome to our speakers this evening, Robert Corbett and Mark Mitchell. 2024 marks the bicentenary of the Royal National Lifeboat Institution, and we will have two talks this evening on the works of the RNLI. Robert will be looking at the lifeboat service in Ulster from its beginning in 1825, and Mark comes home to focus on a centenary of service to the Portrush lifeboat by the Chambers family. I would like to extend a very warm welcome to the members of the Chambers family present this evening. We have Anthony and his wife Marina, Adeline Chambers, the wife of the late Derek Chambers, Carl O'Neill, Jason Chambers, Tyler Chambers, Mark Chambers, and Alistair Chambers. I would also like to thank our founding father and author of many books about Portrush, including From Laura to Katie, the story of the Portrush lifeboat, Mr. Hugh McGrattan. You may be wondering what the relevance of this banner is for tonight's talks, and if you bear with me, I will read this extract from Hugh's book, Portrush, the Port on the Promontory. Over the centuries, Ramore, or Rathmore Great Fort, has been a place of shelter, safety, fortification, defence, observation and navigation. There may have been more than one great fort or castle at different times. It may have been rebuilt or expanded more than once and have had different titles. However, it has long since disappeared. There is no positive trace of it, neither by stone, sketch nor plan, bar a vague impression on one primitive 17th century map. Portrush Castle, Ramore Fort, or the Pile by Portrush, whatever name you wish to give it, is said to have stood on the crest of the rock that formed the southern end of Ramore Head. It certainly seems the most likely place to build a fort. The original builders, according to tradition, were the ancient family of O'Core, whose name survives in the townland of Corstown. The tradition of Castle Antini, or the Castle of Fire, gives the impression of an earlier structure, but was probably the same fort in one of its previous manifestations. It is said that the light that burned in one of its windows inconveniently went out as a vessel drew near, which could suggest the once prevalent and villainous practice of wrecking. As no documentary evidence by way of drawings, plans, or detailed descriptions of the Ramore Fort exists, we have no way of knowing how big it was. We asked local theatre artist Brian Willis to paint us an image of the practice of wrecking, and in the space of a few days, and given complete artistic license, Brian came up with this excellent painting. Our talks tonight, in contrast, are about saving lives at sea, not wrecking them. We have copies of Hugh's book, Portrush, the Port on the Promontory, available for sale at a cost of £10. If you would like one, just contact the desk on your way out. We have a very special thanks tonight to mention to Natasha Garrett and her team at the Portrush Atlantic Hotel for their support over the years. Natasha, your help in making this group a success, it cannot be understated. We would most certainly not be in the position we are in now without your help. And we would like to thank you very much, Natasha, tonight. Thank you. So our first speaker this evening is Robert Corbett, and he is the records manager for Belfast City Council. Robert is responsible for the management of the council's records, both historic and modern. Robert's talk will focus on lifeboat developments in Ulster from the formation of the institution in 1824 and the opening of the first lifeboat station in Ulster in 1825 at Rossglass. Robert, you're most welcome this evening.
Thank you very much. Can I just begin by saying Thank you for the introduction about Belfast, but I'll try to play that down. As you'll detect from the accent, I'm a Tyrone boy. It's not a Belfast accent nor a North Antrim accent. I came up here to go to university in 1982 and never really left, I suppose is the way to put it. And part of the reason why I never left was because I got involved with the RNLI. And just before I give my talk, I want to say what a special honour it is to be to talk here tonight. Because when I came up here, the people I fell in with were Derek Chambers and Anthony Chambers, among many others. I had an uncle in the Royal Navy, the Merchant Navy. I was interested in the sea, I was interested in lifeboats. But the things that I got the opportunity to do with the RNLI, I never would have got to do if it hadn't been for Derek and Anthony. And I'm delighted to be taking part in something that is commemorating and looking at the whole role, the continuing role of the Chambers family and Portrush RNLI generally. So just want to say that first. What I'm going to talk about tonight, those of you who think I'm going to hear about Portrush Lifeboat, you're not. I'll leave that to Mark. I have to obviously mention it in passing, but Portrush Lifeboat Station is so lucky to have a historian of Hugh McGrattan and journalist of Hugh McGrattan's standing that has written the history of Portrush Lifeboat Station. And there's other stations in Northern Ireland and further afield that have people that have kept that tradition and that story going. But a few years ago, when I was sort of no good for anything else, the days of pulling chains and carrying rafts about were over, I was asked if I would put together a talk about the RNLI looking at Northern Ireland or Ulster as a whole, because although you had places like Donaghadee and Portrush, which have still a lifeboat there, there's a lot of other places that had a lifeboat that no longer has one. And that tradition has very much been lost. And so I was tasked with trying to piece this together as a story. And what I want to do tonight is try to put over the general view of what was happening in RNLI and Ulster. I'll obviously be mentioning Portrush in passing just to give context, because like I'm a local historian myself, and sometimes local historians were guilty of being very focused on our own little piece of soil, our own locality, and not looking at it in the broader context. And as a result of that, we miss out in the richness of the story, because it's only when you see what happens locally and how that fits into the broader context that you really realise the significance of what happens in your own place. So thank you very much, and it's a great honour, as I say, to be taking part today. Looking at now briefly at the history of the RNLI in Ulster for the next 25 minutes or so. Like everything else, the Chinese claim that they invented lifeboats, but we're not so absolutely sure about that. They claim everything. But what we do know is that in the late 18th century and early 19th century, there were local communities in the north of England in particular, Northumberland, in Lancashire, starting to think about organising men and boats to save lives at sea, and exactly the opposite to what the wrecking tradition earlier. Sometimes it looked more like what we would see as a lifeboat service. Sometimes it looked more like a Coast Guard service. It was horses patrolling beaches and one thing and another. So this was starting to develop before the formation of the organisation that became the RNLI in 1824, for about 70 years before it. But there was no coordination to it. And here in Ireland, the first record we have of a lifeboat station that we would recognise as lifeboat station was in Dublin, when the authorities that were responsible for the Port of Dublin put a lifeboat, a boat specifically to be a lifeboat at Clontarf in Dublin. And that was the first step at it. But these were all local independent efforts. There was no coordination. They tended to be sort of local philanthropists who did this, or people who had an interest, like the Harbour Commissioners in Dublin. And Lloyd's Insurance Company, of course, they had an interest in well, and they would have funded some of them. But the person who had the idea of a national coordinated lifeboat service was Sir William Hillary. He was from the Isle of Man. Well, he was certainly in the Isle of Man when he had this idea. Anyhow, very colourful character. Sometimes he's described as a soldier, a philanthropist, a campaigner, but equally you could just as easily describe him as a bankrupt and a bigamist. He was a very colourful man, but he had the vision. He had served on a lifeboat in the Isle of Man, and he had the vision, and he went on to be a gold medal winner for rescue, but he had the vision about a coordinated organisation around the whole coast of, we'll call it the British Isles for the sake of argument, to have votes for saving lives at sea. He produced in 1823 a pamphlet. Now, people in the beginning of the 19th century, when they were doing a pamphlet, were a bit long-winded. So the full title of his pamphlet was An Appeal to the British Nation on the Humanity and Policy of Forming a National Institution for the Preservation of Lives and Property from Shipwreck. Now, not short and snappy. He addressed it to the Admiralty, those in charge of the Navy, and said this is really something the government should be taking on. It didn't fit in with government policy in the early 19th century to be providing services like this. The Admiralty didn't want to know, and so with the help of the Archbishop of Canterbury, he and the local MP in London, Thomas Wilson, they arranged a meeting in the City of London Tavern on the 4th of March 1824, and they at that meeting established what we now know as the RNLI, but its initial name was the National Institution for the Preservation of Life from Shipwreck. And because the title was so long, they called it the Shipwreck Institution, which was, after a few years, not considered very appropriate, and was renamed in 1854, the Royal National Lifeboat Institution. Hillary's aims, was to design and build boats specifically to save lives at sea, that they would be automatically manned by crews who were trained to do that job, and that there would be compensation should somebody lose their lives or should they be injured. Because you've got to remember, these men that served in these boats were fishermen. And if anything happened to them, as did when they were serving on them, they were leaving behind a family. And this was what Hillary's idea was. So, turning a bit more close to home, a lot of what I have to talk about at the start of this talk is about County Down. I apologise to everybody from North Antrim. But the RNLI is formed in London in 1824, but the first lifeboat station formed by the new Shipwreck Institution, if you want to call it that, or just for ease, the RNLI, was formed at Rossglass in 1825. For those of you who are not familiar with Rossglass, it's on Drum Bay. It's at the side near St John's Point Lighthouse, going towards Ardglass. In other words, it's the opposite side of Dundrum Bay from Newcastle. The man who was the motivation behind it was a Scotsman called William Ogilvie. He lived in Ardglass Castle. I have a glass of water here. He lived in Ardglass Castle, and he had come over from Scotland to tutor the first Duke of Leinster's children. The first Duke, some of you may have seen a TV programme a few years ago called The Aristocrats, based on a book by a historian by Stella Tilliard. Well, Ogilvie did a bit more than tutored the children. Unfortunately, he also tutored the Duchess of Leinster as well. And after the Duke, well, it was looked upon in a different way in those days. And after the Duke died, the Duke's son left Ogilvie an estate around Ardglass, and that's how he ended up in Ardglass rather than in Leinster. But he had this idea that of developing the area around Ardglass and Rossglass, and the main landlord in the area was the Marquess of Downshire, who was associated with Hillsborough in particular, and Hillsborough Castle was built by his family. He petitioned him about the idea of setting a lifeboat station up on Dundrum Bay, because Dundrum Bay was obviously on the main shipping route from Liverpool, etc., up the Irish Sea and round into Ulster. And he convinced the Marquess that this was necessary. They approached the newly formed Shipwreck Institution, and they were interested in forming the first establishment of a lifeboat in what is now Northern Ireland, or Ulster, at that time. Why did they pick Rossglass? So I need to go back one. The reason why they picked Rossglass is described in a report that was commissioned by the institution by a Coast Guard commander who wrote as follows: Captain Morris, I'm of the opinion that Rossglass would be best selected in my district for a lifeboat, as it could be launched from thence in an easterly gale, and that one is to be the most dreaded in Dundrum Bay. So the choice of Rossglass is actually determined by where it is here. So the most dangerous one is an easterly one coming here. So putting a lifeboat over here was going to be difficult. When you remember this, you'll hear in a moment that these lifeboats were only powered by oar. So you want it here, so it was easier to go out into the bay in the event of a shipping disaster. The lifeboat arrived in Rossglass in December 1825, and we thankfully have a description of what the lifeboat looked like, and this will give you an idea of how it differs from what is sitting in the harbour down the road now. This is a description that Ogilvie left in a letter which I had found many years ago. A very complete article on a new construction, admirably calculated for the preservation of life. The inside is lead colour, the bottom oaken, the upper streak sea green with the words Life Preservation Board for Ross Glass painted in gold and showing on the gunwale. There's a preparation for 6 oars and 6 rowers that they cannot be washed out of the boat, and a cork life jacket for the steersman. But the great curiosity is that if she was filled with water by a sea overwashing her, she would empty herself. The lifeboat is 18 or 18.5 foot long and 6 foot by 6 inches wide at the beam. So that gives you the description of what this lifeboat was like. It wasn't a state-of-the-art machine as we would see it today. It was a rowing boat. Effectively, that's what it was. And Ogilvy was built and designed by an architect called William Plenty from Berkshire in England. But this was the start, the very first station that is a lifeboat station anywhere in Ulster. And in fact, all the lifeboat stations before 1858 were in Dundrum Bay. There was none outside Dundrum Bay until Groomsport was founded in 1858. The lifeboat here at Rossglass was moved to here, to St John's Point in 1835. They opened one in Triella in the 1830s as well, survived for about 10 years, and they actually opened a lifeboat station in Newcastle in 1830. But all the activity was taking place in Dundrum Bay. There was nothing outside it until 1858, and Newcastle now dates its lifeboat station from 1854. But in actual fact, it was founded in 1830 and then lasted to 1833 and then was reopened in 1854. So that's another thing that Portrush has. The lifeboat station has stayed open from the day an hour it was open, unlike Newcastle. As I said a moment ago, prior to 1858, all the lifeboat stations in Ulster were in Dundrum Bay. The first one to be formed outside that was at Groomsport. In 1858. Now, the initial attempts at forming the stations in the 1830s and 40s was quite difficult. I think Ross Glassboat was moved. It was doing some rescues. We know the name of the first coxswain. He was awarded a gold medal for a rescue, Mr. Foy, that he conducted not on a lifeboat but in another fishing vessel. But really, the pattern of these new stations was very sporadic, and it was a bit like the new institution itself. In 1949, it didn't even have the ability to launch an appeal for funds in the British Isles. That changes in 1851 when the 4th Duke of Northumberland becomes the president, but probably more significantly, the appointment of what we would call a chief executive, but he was called then an on-sec in charge of this institution, Richard Lewis, who was a barrister, and he transforms the organisation and creates it into the RNLI. It's renamed in 1854 as the RNLI. And over the next 20, 30 years, that's when you see the massive big expansion of lifeboats, not only in England, but also here in Ulster. And the first one outside the Drum Bay was at Groomsport. Now, this is the picture here is not the one that was the first lifeboat. The first lifeboat in Groomsport was much smaller. It was probably, it was an orange sails lifeboat. We don't know the name of it. It cost £127 to build. So it probably was a converted boat. I'm not 100% sure that it wasn't a purpose-built one. The records aren't very clear on that. But it cost £129. It's, you know, just to give you an idea of the figures of cost compared to where we are in a few years' time. Groomsport had 3 lifeboats by the time this photograph was taken. This is the 3rd lifeboat, and why I wanted to show these photographs was it gives you an idea of what lifeboat work was like in the 1890s. They're quite a unique set of photographs. Now, when Mark and the boys go out, they've all got cameras on their helmets and one thing and another. Photography was still quite young in the 1890s. And this is a series of photographs of the George Poole lifeboat, which was the 3rd lifeboat at Groomsport. It served at Groomsport from 1885 to 1901. It cost £329. So the first one at Groomsport, £129. This one's £329. Price is going up, but it was called to do a rescue of 2 vessels that had got caught in a gale off Bangor. They put down anchor. They were being pulled off their anchors, and the Groomsport lifeboat was taken by horses, and danger of being washed on the rocks, was taken by horses and carriage from Groomsport to Bangor. And you'll see Bangor is very recognisable after you see a couple of these photographs. 2 vessels were the Harp from Arklow and the Hollyhow from Galway, and the harp was bringing coal from Glasgow to Ireland. So this is the lifeboat here being launched at Bangor, having been brought around by the horses. And then we have it coming alongside to the quay to take on the rest of the crew and whatever other bits of equipment they needed. And then there we have it going out to sea in a gale in 1897. You can see Bangor very distinctly there in the background, anybody that knows Bangor. There is the lifeboat, the small vessel here, at one of the other two vessels. Now, I don't know if it's the harp or the Hollyhow. It's one of the two. But you can see the small lifeboat with its oars at the vessel. And here we have it at near where Ballyholme Yacht Club is now, boat club is now, letting off people that is rescued. It actually rescued 4 crew from the harp and 8 people from the Hollyhow. That's just to give an idea of what a rescue was like and what it was like in a lifeboat in the 1890s. And I haven't got time to go through all the lifeboat stations, so I just wanted to pick that one up about Groomsport. A few years ago, well, it's a long time ago now, 24 years ago, I had the pleasure of chairing a lifeboat appeal here in Portrush to buy a lifeboat, the local appeal. And there was a man from Ballymena who used to collect for me around Ballymena and other places. And he phoned me one day in Belfast and he said, you wouldn't call on the way home. I knew I worked Belfast, I was coming back down here. You wouldn't call on your way home? I said, sure, I will. And he handed me this photograph. And the lifeboat that I have just shown you during the rescue in 1897, this is the coxswain of it, Henry Watterson. It turns out it was his grandfather. And he knew I was doing work on the history of lifeboats and stuff. And so that he wanted to give me the picture, so or a copy of the picture. So the photographs that we just saw there at Groomsport, that is the man who was coxswain. He was coxswain from 1888 to 1917, a very long period of service in tough conditions. So I'm not going to talk really about Portrush, but I have to mention it because just to put it into the context. So as I've said, the lifeboat stations before 1858 were all in Dundum Bay. Then we have Groomsport in 1858. And then we have the first lifeboat station in County Antrim. And for a long time, the only lifeboat station in County Antrim. Of course, Portrush Lifeboat Station, founded in 1860, due largely to the efforts of Laura Countess of Antrim and the Reverend Jonathan Simpson, who made sure the lifeboat stayed, because as we all know, I'm not going to go into any detail, Hugh has covered it numerous times. In 1863, there was a proposal that the Portrush lifeboat be moved to Greencastle, but in the best traditions of negotiation, it was decided rather than moving the lifeboat from Portrush that they would open another lifeboat station in Donegal in Greencastle. So Greencastle was the first lifeboat. Portrush was the first lifeboat in County Antrim. Greencastle was the first lifeboat in 1864. It was founded in County Donegal. And the second one then was Ardmore, which a lot of people in the room will have links with until 1883. But if you're on the golf course at Greencastle, you will see this little building. And this was the first lifeboat house and only lifeboat house at Greencastle. I'll come back to Greencastle later on. But it was built by, it was known as the Greencastle lifeboat, but quite often it was known as the Londonderry lifeboat as well, or the Derry lifeboat, whichever you prefer, because the harbour commissioners in Londonderry were really the driving force behind this lifeboat station being formed. If you read some of the accounts, they'll say it was because of the dangers of the Toons Bank and the foil, but the really way it was formed was because the passenger liners leaving Derry to go to America and Canada, basically they were based at Moville. They were brought out by tender to Moville, and that's really why the lifeboat station was opened there in the 1860s. As I said, the change in the RNLI in 1851 with Richard Lewis taking over as the ONSEC of the whole organisation, saw a number of lifeboat stations being formed. One that we might not be familiar with is Ballywalter, again down the Ards Peninsula, formed 6 years after Portrush. So you're starting to see these number of these stations now being opened. It stays open to 1906. Ballywalter is quite interesting for a couple of reasons. They had 2 lifeboats during their time, and they seem to have a particular connection with the Church of Ireland clergy. There was a Reverend Wilson who was involved with the lifeboat, but most significantly, a Reverend J. O'Reilly Blackwood. And he was awarded a silver medal for a rescue he did on the 4th of March 1881 to a vessel called the Castlemaine that was in difficulty. But the other reason I want to mention Ballywalter is because it tells us something about the dangers of serving on a lifeboat, not only at this time, but at any time. But there was tragedy in this station. The first coxswain of the Ballywalter lifeboat lost his life at sea. The lifeboat was out on an exercise on the 26th of December, what we would call Boxing Day or St. Stephen's Day. On practice exercise, the lifeboat capsized and they lost their coxswain, Robert Boyd. He was drowned. Just to put in context the perils of what it was, as well as showing how these lifeboat stations developed. And of course, here in Portrush, I'm not going to dwell on it either. You know, there was our own lifeboat disaster on the 1st of November, 1889, when 3 lifeboat men were killed at Blackrock Strand. One of them was leading Coast Guard, Mr. Galbraith Hamilton Grills, and James McAllister and William McNeil, 2 local men. So just put in context of what the danger was, and of course this is a photograph of Galbraith Hamilton Grills' grave and monument in Ballywalloon Church. The other thing to bear in mind, of course, is that if anything did go wrong at sea, there was lots of, sometimes the same members of the one family on the boat. Lochie Lifeboat Station in County Down, and all of these new stations founded in 1885. And this is a photograph taken in 1908. And we're here tonight marking the dedication of service to RNLI of the Chambers family. This is one of the things about the old fishing communities that maybe has changed more radically. We're lucky here in Portrush that the Chambers tradition has gone on and on. But that picture taken in 1908, there's 8 members of the Young family from Kirkistan. So if you have a disaster or lose something on a boat at sea, it's a big thing for the community, but it equally could have been a big thing for 1 or 2 individual families. So it needs to be borne in mind, but it ties in well with what we're trying to do here this evening. Carrickfergus Lifeboat, I said that Portrush was founded in 1860. This is another one of these new stations founded in 1896. Carrickfergus is sort of directly opposite Groomsport, and that's part of the reason why it was founded. And again, it's got to do with the wind. We're still in the age of oar and sail. It's got to do with the wind, and most disasters and incidents on Belfast Lough tend to be on the County Down side. That is the most dangerous side of the lough. But what was found was that if the wind was coming from the north or the northwest, the Groomsport lifeboat could not be launched. And you saw earlier when I showed the photographs of Groomsport, it had to be pulled by horse and carriage to Bangor. That was probably because it was quicker to do that than bring it round against the wind. Okay, so the idea in the early 1890s was to form a second lifeboat station in County Antrim. Not anything to do with Portrush or to assist Portrush, but more to assist the County Down lifeboat at Groomsport. And it stayed there until 1913. Now that's the lifeboat there, sitting in the harbour. But then they built a boathouse for it because Carrickfergus Lifeboat is very tidal and becomes a mud bath. But there's another one then of the Carrickfergus boat being launched from its boathouse, which was just outside the harbour wall of Carrickfergus. Carrickfergus Lifeboat is closed down in 1913, so it had a very short existence between 1896 and 1913. And the reason for its short existence will become apparent. The official RNLI reason was that they had difficulty getting a permanent crew. Now, the fishing industry was already in decline. There wasn't the same number of fishing men around Carrickfergus, but I would suggest that that's not the real reason why it was closed. And the real reason I think it was closed was the creation of a new lifeboat station at Donaghadee in 1910. Now, there's great friendliness between Donaghadee and Portrush, but there's also great rivalry. And of course, they're only a modern lifeboat station compared to Portrush. But I think we've heard that before, Anthony. But Donaghadee is a brand new lifeboat station created in 1910. And it also brand new, and it is also the first lifeboat station to have a motorised lifeboat, a lifeboat with a Blake engine. And this is it here. When you look first at this photograph, the first thing you see are the sails, and you'll also see the oars there. This lifeboat had an engine. It was called the William and Laura. Some of the local wags in Donegal, given its red, white and blue tradition, suggest it could have been called the William and Mary. But it's called the William and Laura. It cost £3,599. It's a 43-foot Watson class lifeboat. It's capable of 7 knots. And of course, it's faster. The range of this lifeboat is not dependent on the wind. Yeah, it's not dependent on the power. It's got much greater range. And for that reason, therefore, you see that Carrickfergus is closed in 1913, and neighbouring lifeboat stations are closed very soon afterwards. You didn't need as many lifeboats around the coast that were oars and sailed because you had a motor lifeboat here. And then, of course, here in Portrush, the motor lifeboat, the TBBH, comes in 1924, which I've no doubt you'll hear about more from Mark in a moment. It cost £7,438. So you can see the price is going up, but you can still see the sail and the oar on that boat as well. And of course, the big impact of this decision to put a motor lifeboat at Portrush comes to the end of the Greencastle lifeboat station. Greencastle lifeboat, that was the fourth one at Greencastle, the Britain Willis. It was an oar and sailing lifeboat. It didn't have the range of a motor lifeboat, and Greencastle is closed in September 1924 to coincide with the arrival of a motor lifeboat in Portrush. And this is it being brought into the quay in Derry to put on a train to be taken to Dublin, where it served as a relief lifeboat at Howth. And that's just the crew of Greencastle. I just like that photograph. Newcastle, modern lifeboat, the PH, and St Helen, another motor lifeboat. This was the coxswain of the Newcastle boat at that time. And really then the point is that because you had all these small oared sailing lifeboat stations like Carrickfergus and Groomsport all closed down, you only have 4 lifeboat stations covering all of Northern Ireland. You have Portrush, Donegal, Cloghy and Newcastle. And basically from the 1920s to 1960s, the whole coast of Northern Ireland was covered by 4 lifeboat stations, and going toward Donegal, you had nothing until you came to Arnmore. And Arnmore got a motor lifeboat in 1929. But probably the most famous lifeboat rescue, certainly up until fairly recently, is this lifeboat here, Donegal. This is Samuel Kelly, which of course is famous for the role it played in the Princess Victoria disaster in 1953, 31st of March 1953. And this is the crew of the Donegal that lifeboat that performed that rescue when they saved 34 people off the Princess Victoria. There was 133 people lost their lives altogether that day. But again, it's come back to make a point to tie in with why we're here tonight that I'm showing this photograph. There's a number of Nelsons in this photograph, and again, it's showing that link that particular families in different coastal areas have with their lifeboat, as a tradition that also continues to this day. RNLI, changes in the use of the sea. In the 1960s, you see a change in use of the sea, where there's increased use for leisure purposes rather than for the normal industrial purpose and fishing purposes. And they introduce rescue lifeboats, inshore lifeboats, like basically a rubber dinghy type lifeboat. The first station in Northern Ireland was 1965, was at Bangor, and this is the Bangor crew along with their on sec after they conducted their first rescue just a few weeks after they were formed in 1965. The RNLI started experimenting with these in 1963, and then we had Red Bay, formed in County Antrim in 1972, Portaferry in County Down in 1980, Kilkeel in 1986. And alongside these changes then of inshore lifeboats, the RNLI was also developing new fast all-weather lifeboats to replace. The first lifeboat I saw in Portrush as a boy was the Lady Scott, capable of about 8 knots, 7, 8 knots. But in the 1980s, they introduced these new fast all-weather lifeboats. Now, that's the most famous photograph of a lifeboat ever, I suspect. I'm not going to talk about that. That's the 13th of February, 1989. I'm not going to talk about that, but this is the Richard Evans 5216 that come here, and 1981, and then 4 years later, Donegal gets the city of Belfast. But it's to show that the RNLI is building these inshore lifeboats, but they're building these new fast all-weather lifeboats. It costs £300,000 The Lady Scott, I think it cost about £19,000 in 1949. So you can see how it's going up. Again, also there's new stations being formed to support around the coast. Larne is founded. And then, of course, we have the Katie Hannon coming here in 2000. I had the pleasure of chairing that appeal in Mark. I think that's you standing there on the right at the bow as we look at it. Anthony was on the boat that day as well. Hugh McGrattan was on it with me as well. Probably one of my proudest days when that boat came into the harbour. But the RNLI, and I'm going to wind up now, you'll be pleased to know, the RNLI is a unique combination of people that go to sea to save lives and people who fundraise. And I just want to finish with a couple of fundraising photographs, particularly this one. The RNLI has always been funded by donations. There's never been any government funding. Okay, there was a referendum in the RNLI in the early 70s when that idea of government funded was rejected, and it was the right decision, I think. But somebody mentioned earlier that I was the archivist, the records manager. Many years ago, Beth Duffin, who was the district organiser of the RNLI in Northern Ireland for many years, gave me a photograph that was in bits. And anybody that knows Beth knows what she was like, and there's a few people in here does. She didn't mince her words. She says, Robert, put that photograph back together and tell me what it is. You know, so I started to work on it. When a mate of mine who's a paper conservator really did the work. And he got it restored back so we could see what it was. And it's the first lifeboat. It's a lifeboat Saturday in Belfast in 1898. It's actually the second lifeboat Saturday. When I saw the photograph, I hadn't a clue what it was. I knew that it probably had something to do with nautical things because of the boat, which I identified as not a lifeboat, but a ship's lifeboat off the SS Oceanic, which was being built in Harland and Wolff at that time. I could tell that because there's a wee badge over here. And traced it back. And so worked it out through the old newspapers that it was in October 1898. And the reason why the photograph was taken and survived was that the little boys in the lifeboats were the grandchildren of the Lord Mayor of Belfast, who was Henderson, who also owned the newsletter. So we were able to track it down. But what this is the beginnings of what we understand as fundraising. The first one had been held in Manchester in 1891. There had been an earlier one in Belfast in 1894. It's really like a Lord Mayor's parade, but really it's a forerunner to this type of lunacy that we all used to be involved in Portrush. Thank you all very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robert. That was fascinating. You mentioned the lifeboat disaster in Portrush, and just to bring all of your attention, we had a picture brought down by Paul Ross, which shows a lifeboat very similar to the Robert and Agnes Blair that capsized with the loss of 3 crew. So the crew consisted of 10 oarsmen, bowman, coxswain and second coxswain, a total of 13 men. The picture captures the drama and the conditions facing those lifeboat men, which has been very ably described to us this evening by Robert. Thank you very much. So our thanks to Paul and Claire Ross for bringing the picture down for display. And please do make sure you have a look at it before you leave this evening. It's a lovely, lovely picture. Our second speaker this evening has been with the RNLI for over 35 years and has served as a coxswain and mechanic for over 20 years. For the last 6 years, he has been a full-time member of the RNLI training team, working all over the UK and Ireland. Last year, he gained his master's ticket for 200-ton vessels. Mark's talk brings the RNLI, the RNLI story home to Portrush, featuring research undertaken by Francis Wilson, who's also here this evening, on the 100 years commitment to the lifeboat service by the Chambers families. Mark, we thank you very much for coming this evening and arranging your busy schedule to come and talk to us.
Thanks very much for having me. I was absolutely delighted to be asked to do this. It's been my privilege to have known almost all the people in this photograph and to have served on the lifeboat with 4 of them. And one of the others gave me my first run on the lifeboat and started it all. So it's an absolute delight to be here and be able to talk about this. Now, I could talk about lifeboats all night, but you'd be glad to know I'm not going to. I'll only talk for a short time around the slides and the great research that's been done by Francis Wilson. And thank you very much for that. So we can see the a load of pictures there, which are lovely, of the Chambers family. Sadly, the ones on the left-hand side are no longer with us. The ones on the right-hand side are very much with us and all here tonight. And I'm hoping to be able to talk about each one in turn. It's very interesting following on from, it's delighted to be able to follow on from Robert's talk too. It was fascinating. I could listen to that all night. And one of the interesting things Robert talked about was the evolution of lifeboats right through as they got their upgrades, let's say. So it started off with powering them by oars. Then they got upgraded to be powered by sails with oars. Then they got upgraded to be powered by engines. And it was at that point that they realized, imagine what it must have been like to keep a petrol engine with spark plugs going from that era at sea. So they needed a lifeboat mechanic, and that became the key pivotal role in every lifeboat station. And I'll come to that because that's where our Chambers connection begins. But in 1924, and Robert has mentioned this lifeboat, Portrush received a new motor lifeboat, the first motor lifeboat called the TBBH. Now, the way you get your name on a lifeboat is, of course, to fund it. And this one was actually funded by 4 people. Mrs. Margaret Phoebe Thornton of Putney, Mr. Thomas Bartlett, there's the B, of Liverpool, Miss Isabella Louisa Browsted of Blackheath, and Miss Arabella Hooper of Leamington, hence TBBH. She was the first motor lifeboat stationed at Portrush and served from the 8th of July 1924 to July 1949, and then continued to serve on the relief fleet. And would you believe the boat still exists in private hands and still sails today, such as the quality of lifeboats and materials that they built of back then. During her service, she was launched 78 times and saved 17 lives. But this meant that a full-time mechanic was required. And this is what began the Chambers family connection with the Portrush lifeboat. So Carl Chambers, applications for the post of mechanic were invited, and a total of 8 applicants applied. And Carl Chambers of Princess Street, a 33-year-old Royal Navy veteran, was appointed. During his time in the Navy, he had served on destroyers in the North Sea, risen to the rank of petty officer, and had been coxswain of a naval motorboat. He also worked for the Coast Guard and had responsibility for firing the Maroons from Ramore Head. Everybody remembers those, I'm sure. One of his first jobs as part of the 8-man crew was to bring TBBH from the builder's yard in Cowes, what we would call a passage today. And she was welcomed on arrival at Portrush by a large crowd and a bonfire on Ramore Head. He served as the station's full-time mechanic until 1947. And during that time, the thanks of the institution inscribed in vellum were awarded to coxswain James Martin and mechanic K.D. Chambers for rescuing John Fleming, a member of the crew, when he was washed out of the lifeboat whilst on service in tremendous seas on the 19th of October 1935. That he was found and rescued was due to the presence of mind and splendid seamanship of the coxswain, the promptness of which the motor mechanic carried out his orders, and the coolness and discipline of his crew. And of course, you could see from Robert's talk just what that must have involved in those days. And we didn't have the fancy controls to control engines in those days. It needed a lot of coordination between the crew and mechanic to make sure the boat could turn and be able to be handled in rough seas. This is the lifeboat crew in 1935. You can see the names there. In the back row, though, from left, Carl Chambers was the mechanic in the cap there, and I'm sure some of those names are familiar to many. Is Paul Ross in the audience? Ah, right, because Paul, brilliant. Thank you, Paul, because he would have known quite a few of these names, and quite a few of the names reoccurred, like Flemings and Strathdees, etc. But Carl Chambers is there just on the top left. That's the boathouse that is currently there. You can tell by the windows. Now, Gilbert Chambers, that was Carl's son. Is that right, Anthony? And Anthony's father. And Gilbert, I'm sure a lot of us in this room knew Gilbert, worked in the Scotch shop. And I knew him very well. And at that time, I tortured my parents because the Scotch shop had a lovely little slipway lifeboat that you put a coin in. And I tortured my parents for that, to allow the lifeboat to go down the slipway. And that's when I got to know Gilbert Chambers, and tortured him as a 4-year-old kid until he took me by the arm and hung me down and let me onto the lifeboat for Flag Day. And I got a trip round the Skerries, and the rest is history, because that was me hooked. So he actually gave me my first experience of lifeboats. Gilbert was Carl's son, also a Royal Navy veteran, and a former member of HM Coast Guard, and he'd helped his father from 1937 and was well versed with the job when he took over 10 years later. And he was in post when the station's new lifeboat, the Lady Scott, arrived in 1949, and served as mechanic until he sadly passed away suddenly at the age of 59 in May 1978. He took part, and we'll hear in a moment about the Argo Delos rescue. I've spoken about that before in here, if you remember. And also the Bergen services, and for each was awarded the institution's thanks on vellum. He was subsequently awarded the British Empire Medal for his work with the RNLI in the Queen's Birthday Honours of 1975. The medal being formally presented to him at a ceremony in Hillsborough Castle by Lord Clanwilliam, who was the Lord Lieutenant of County Down. And in 1976, he also took on the role of second coxswain and was honoured to be a member of the RNLI's crew, representing the RNLI at the Queen's Silver Jubilee Review at Spithead in 1977, which was amazing. Now, the Lady Scott, this is the lifeboat that Robert remembers first, and I remember first from Portrush. You used to just about be able to peer through the windows of the boathouse and see it. And it was a big occasion whenever it used to launch an exercise or shouts. And she was brought from Cowes in the Isle of Wight, where she was built over an 8-day period, by a crew which included Sam Cunningham as the coxswain and Carl Chambers as mechanic. And she was officially named by the Countess of Antrim. Not the original one, I imagine, but very nice to see a successor, because if you remember, Laura, Countess of Antrim, that was mentioned by Robert back in the day, was the one who instigated the lifeboat in Portrush and had that lifeboat named after her. So that's the Lady Scott. Love that photograph, because you see the stone bins that were very familiar to us all. And again, a lot of those names would be very familiar to all of us harbour lizards, as we used to call ourselves. But Mac O'Neill, Jimmy Stewart, Billy Lee, Gilbert Chambers, Fred Williams, and Bobby McMullen. And that's them sitting there. I think that does look like it's in the boathouse, but it looks like they're telling some real salty sea tales there, which is great. But it was wonderful to see that lifeboat launch on its regular exercises, and again on shouts after the Maroons had gone off. The Argo Delos was a huge rescue in the life of the RNLI, and it was the Lady Scott that took part in one of the most daring rescues undertaken by the Portrush Lifeboat, and she saved the lives of 14 crew from the cargo vessel Argo Delos. That's it sitting there at Torbeg, which is just really kind of near Innistrahull. For this service, Sam Cunningham, the coxswain, received the RNLI's silver medal, and Robert McMullen, second coxswain, received the RNLI's bronze medal, and the remainder of the crew received the institution's thanks on vellum. That crew, that ship later broke up, and one half of it anyway is a dive site off Innistrahull, and that was the lifeboat was very badly damaged during that by the sea, and had to go away for a long time. Such was the power of the sea, and she came back fully repaired, and we can see the crew there, and I'm sure people know quite a few of the faces. But that's Gilbert there in the hat, in the mechanic's cap, just second from the left. The Bergen was a Norwegian frigate, and this is a very interesting one, because this was on the 1st of November 1965, and the Lady Scott was involved in a dramatic rescue when 4 men were lost overboard from the Norwegian frigate Bergen in a northwesterly storm with a very rough sea. The weather conditions were so bad that the RNLI inspector said it was too dangerous to launch the lifeboat, but the crew made the decision to go. Sadly, the men were never found, but what brave men they were to launch when they said it wasn't even possible to launch. The thanks of the institution were inscribed on vellum and awarded to the coxswain and to each member of the crew in recognition of their courage in launching the lifeboat. And the citation spoke of the calculated courage of the coxswain and crew in deciding to launch. And again, we can see in the front row Gilbert Chambers, who got the thanks on vellum. And I think that will be up in the boathouse now. The renovations are open. That or a copy of it will be in the boathouse, that original vellum. Now, some people may have seen this photograph before, particularly in our friend Hugh's book. But I said there was a nice picture of Joe coming up. And there it is, the very famous and formidable on-sec Joe Scott in the suede coat there. And you probably know an awful lot of the names there. Billy Lee, Noel Black, Jimmy Stewart, the coxswain, etc. Even Tony McNamee in the front. But that's Gilbert again in the hat, and our very good friend John Scott just to the right of him. But that was crew, officials and shore helpers. Now it's remarkable, Robert referred to the fact this is 200 years of the RNLI. That was actually the 150th anniversary. And it's amazing that some of those people, you know, led on to give the legacy that we have today. Some of them are still with us. And the gear, though, is very, very different, isn't it? But quite amazing. That's 50 years ago, almost to the day. In 1971, the rededication of the Lady Scott took place. So I'm fairly sure that would have been when she came back from maybe a major refit. And at that time, refits would happen to upgrade the lifeboat's gear, etc. You can see again, the gear is very different. And members of the Portrush Lifeboat with a guest of honour. And again, W.R. Knox, who was Joe's father, isn't that right? But Gilbert, once again in that photograph with the cap, who is just there, the one without the coat, in fact, in the RNLI Guernsey. Now this, I'm delighted Adeline's here this evening. This was the first coxswain I served under. This was Derek Chambers. Derek, an absolute legend of a man, very, very fine boat handler. And Derek was appointed mechanic on the death of his family and later took on the additional role of coxswain. And in doing so, he became one of the very few full-time coxswain mechanics in the RNLI. That's pretty much a standard role now. But so Derek was a trailblazer in that role. And during his year's service, 84 lives were saved by the lifeboats he maintained. So there's many changes during Derek's time because, as you know, we talked about the fishing fleet and everything, and then Robert alluded to the fact that the use of the sea was changing. So much more in the way of nautical-based activity happened: sailing, angling, surfing, kayaking, and because of that, then 1981 saw the arrival of a lifeboat with a top speed almost double of that of the Lady Scott, 16 to 18 knots, and a much greater range. Remarkably then, it didn't need a boathouse. You can see the height of it. The big orange superstructure was to help it self-right on its own, whereas the Lady Scott needed airbags to do that. It had wonderful big Caterpillar engines that Derek maintained. And that's her just after. That was she was repainted and re-logoed for the 175th anniversary of the RNLI, and that was the new logos that she got there. 1993 saw an inshore inflatable lifeboat placed on trial in Portrush, and that became very much a part of the furniture here, given the types of shouts that needed to happen. This was the naming ceremony. Again, there's Derek in his cap, right in the middle there, beside another very famous lifeboat man, one of the most famous lifeboat men certainly in my living history, and that was Richard Evans. Richard Evans was a Welsh coxswain who had several gold medals to his name, and he was absolutely delighted, made great friends here. So named after the RNLI's greatest living hero. She was a very different craft to any that had served in Portrush. And the Richard Evans saved 70 lives in the course of 316 shouts, or services as they're called, and in a 4-day period in 1987, spent more than 25 hours at sea. A lot of people maybe have a copy of this book. This was the booklet that was brought out, and it's a very interesting read. Look at that, price a pound. When you go in there, though, there's a lot of adverts for a lot of shops that are sadly no longer with us, and those are in the days before websites. So if you can get hold of a copy of that, it's actually a very interesting read. Now, you'll have seen this gentleman pop up on a photograph in Robert's chat. He was, you'll probably remember, one of the Presbyterian ministers at the Presbyterian Church in Portrush, and he was on the crew, and he was called to the lifeboat on several occasions by the Maroons back in the day, and in true Presbyterian fashion, he made sure the doors were shut and the collection was taken before he left. So he got his priorities right. And we were very honoured back in 1994 when the first official, we had an inshore lifeboat on station, but the lifeboat then was named after him, the Jonathan Simpson. 1987 was a very busy year for Portrush Lifeboat. In 1987, there were 24 call-outs and 5 lives saved, and one of these was actually Richard Branson. I remember this coming right over the town. I'm sure a lot of people do as well. Unbelievably huge. This was as much publicised crossing of the Atlantic in a hot air balloon from Sugarloaf Mountain in Maine to Glasgow, and it was curtailed by poor weather in Scotland. The balloon made a crash landing near Limavady and then continued along the coast towards Portrush. And you remember it crashed, it first hit the water just behind the Skerries, and then the Maroons went off and we all ran down to the harbour. I sadly didn't get out on that shout. But the pilot, Per Lindstrand, leapt out near Portrush, leaving Branson on his own to bring the balloon down near Rathlin. 3 helicopters, HMS Argonaut and the Portrush Lifeboat were all involved in rescuing Richard Branson. Per Lindstrand was picked up by the local diver Nigel Lynch, known to us all fondly as Muttley, don't ask me why, and taken to Portrush. And remember that helicopter landing on the quay to get him to a waiting ambulance. But Robert showed this photograph as well, and indeed it has become a very, very famous photograph, gone all over the world, and was even donated to the Queen Mother because there was a lifeboat named after her. The boat was in very safe hands that day because Derek was coxswain and Anthony was in charge of the engine, so very, very safe hands. Incredible seas. What you don't see in the window furthest back on the starboard side was a frightened little face, and that was mine. But I knew we were in safe hands because Derek was at the helm that day, although he did say to us, and I honestly remember this, he said, "Look, guys, there'll be no shame in turning yourself down for this one. We might not come back from this one." But thankfully we did after a night in Donegal, and when we came back the next day, it was as flat as that road. The storm had passed through. It was the tail end of a hurricane, which had, we always got tail ends of hurricanes coming from America. So that was 30-foot waves at 113 miles per hour, according to the weather station at Malin Head. And say Derek and Anthony both on that shout. You can see Derek again, just 1, 2, 3, 4th from the left there with the cap on. That was the Centenary. Again, Robert mentioned this, the Blackrock disaster where the lifeboat lost 3 members of its crew. This was a commemoration for that. Remarkable when you see it now. I know everybody in there. There's our good friends that we've known all the time. But I'll tell you what, to imagine having a photograph taken now without life jackets, we'd all be fired. So quite amazing. But that's a very nice photograph and a lovely moment in time. So again, tying in with what Robert said, and Robert was a huge driving force in Portrush Raft Race. And the Portrush Raft Race then was instigated in May 1982. Our very own John McNally and John Scott were absolutely pivotal in the instigation of it, and of course the Harbour Bar, which was your fine establishment, was I think where the first meeting took place. The fundraising idea, great impact in the town for many years to come. In its first year, it raised £3,500, but by 1995, this had gone 10 times up to £35,000 and attracted teams from far and wide and became the focus of a weekend of activities at the port, fondly remembered by anybody who served on the crew. And thanks very much to everybody that did that. It has been a huge impact on the fundraising in Portrush. Derek then retired. Back in the day, you had retired 55, which was far too young, lots of service to give, but this was Derek and Adeline with his coxswain's certificate of service. And then Adeline instigated, after the sad passing of Derek, he retired in 1998. That is the lovely inscription on the flagpole, which is just outside the boathouse. You can see that inscription when you go past in marble. And following his retirement in 1998, he was awarded the RNLI's Thanks on Vellum, and the frame certificate was presented to him by the Duke of Kent, who still is president of the RNLI, at the Katie Hannon naming ceremony in the year 2000. I say the flagpole there proudly flies the RNLI flag every day of the year. And now we come, there's a lovely salty picture of Anthony there. We come to one of my dearest friends in the lifeboat, Anthony. I've got a lovely story about him in a moment. But Anthony took over, and this was great because now there had been a succession all the way through. And Anthony took over as mechanic from his brother in 1998. And during his 40 years service, we'll talk about that in a moment, he was responsible for the engines of 3 lifeboats, the Richard Evans, the Katie Hannon, and the William Gordon Burr. New ILBs were introduced, and there were several dramatic rescues, in which one of which Anthony played a major role in rescuing boys from a cave in Castle Rock. Going to come to that separately. He also received a Queen's Jubilee Medal in 2003 for his long service. Now, as I say, 40 years. Anthony had spent time in the boathouse from a young age and had been on boats from the age of 12, and he was very familiar with the sound of the telephone, which is how boats were called out in those days. The telephone at the bottom of the stairs would have been a harbinger that the boat was needed, and the crew then would be walking down to the boat as the maroons would be going off. So having spent many hours helping and watching with lifeboat launches, he remembers the crews reaching up for their suits of trousers with bib and brace and a smock, like you saw there, from a pulley above the boat, and putting them on in the cramped conditions. Anthony then was credited with 40 years, but actually had done the job probably since 15, but 40 years to keep it legal. That's what Anthony was awarded, was for 40 years, but it actually was many, many more that he served on the slipway, launching the lifeboat. So my story about Anthony, I have many stories about Anthony. This one I pick out, but when I was young and keen on lifeboats, I was coming back from Belfast one day, and just as I got to Portrush at Margoth Caravan Site, you remember, it's now a new name, my pager went off. It was a massive storm, and a Russian ship just off Islay had lost its rudder and had gone to anchor, and the anchor was in danger of dragging and then foundering on the shore. Islay Lifeboat had been out for about 8 hours with them, and they needed help. So we were sent to go and take over from Islay Lifeboat. On the way over in the boarding boat, as all the crew will know, there's a fair bit of chat. And I said, I was really lucky. I was just so lucky. I just got into Portrush and my pager went off. About 8 hours later, we're in a terrible sea hanging off the back of this ship. And I'm on the back end being violently ill. And Anthony comes out, leans on the rails for a while, looks at me thoughtfully and says, how effing lucky do you feel now? Anthony also oversaw again, Robert alluded to this, lifeboats just kept evolving. Although this might look very similar to, this might look very similar to the Richard Evans. This was a much more state-of-the-art lifeboat, and he had to go away, do the 40-hour trials, do the trials, and bring that boat to station. And she served there until 2008. When this happened, and what's known as the Katie Hannon disaster. Now, Anthony wasn't on the boat that night, I hasten to add, but another member of the Chambers family was, who was Carl O'Neill. And Carl and I Well, I nearly lost my life in this one by when we capsized in the Y boat, and I was saved by none other than Carl O'Neill, who dragged me ashore like a wet doll. And yeah, despite the fact I taught him at school, you think he could probably have left me there after all the homework he gave. Now, Anthony never shied away from publicity. If you believe that, you believe anything. So look at the very sheep. How delighted do you think Anthony was to be chosen as the poster boy from the RNLI for the fundraising for the Severn? So you can see quite a cheerful looking Anthony in the picture and quite a sheepish looking Anthony there. And that's just there at the Metropole corner. Oh, sorry. The lifeboat was then replaced by the William Gordon Burr, which still proudly sits in the harbour. And she is exactly the same class, an absolutely wonderful boat. Just a couple more things about Anthony just before we leave Anthony and get on to the remaining members. Anthony and Damien, they again won an award. Everybody knows Damien from the shop, but they very bravely went to the rescue of a member of the public who was stuck on a ledge at Ramore Head. And they went out in the inshore lifeboat and climbed, Damien climbed the cliff, held onto the boy until the Coast Guard could rescue them. And both Anthony and Damien got commendations for their actions. And on the subject of commendations, Anthony did the most incredibly brave thing when he dived into the water off the lifeboat, swam into a cave to rescue two boys. The inshore lifeboat tried and tried to get in and rescue them. Anthony was the only one who did, and he got the bronze medal. This is the bronze medal to mechanic Anthony Chambers for saving two boys cut off by the tide in a cave on 5th of August 2009. And the inshore lifeboat made several unsuccessful attempts, and Anthony went in and swam out. And by the time he got out with the second one, he said all his energy was spent. And you know, he actually was due to get in trouble for that, for leaving the lifeboat while being in charge of the engines, as his brother Derek did once before, and as the next mechanic did after that. So it's a running theme in Portrush that the crew can't do it, the mechanics do. And this was Anthony's retirement after, as I say, 40 years of service. That was the crew, shore crew officials there, but I say 40 years is a nominal amount. Now, the life-saving work of the Chambers family continues, because here, and I'm glad to have them here, we've got Carl O'Neill, who styles him very much. He's called after Carl Chambers and is very proud of that fact. And Jason Chambers. Carl is a mechanic. Sorry, Carl is a coxswain, and Jason is a mechanic. Again, keeping the mechanic traditions of the Chambers. So Carl is the lifeguard supervisor for the area, so actually has a full-time job within the RNLI, and he's also was appointed coxswain, one of the coxswains in October 2022. Jason, you can tell when this wedding was by the garb that the crew have. He's one of the mechanics that covers the absence of the main mechanic when they are there. And does a great job. Again, the connection with mechanic is pretty obvious, which is brilliant. Fannet Head Rescue. So this was again in a huge sea. 3 lifeboat crews, Loch Swilly, Arranmore and Portrush, were requested to launch their all-weather lifeboat by Belfast Coast Guard. This was the 14th of December 2019. There was a Mayday alert from a 45-foot fishing boat. They had gotten difficulty 20 miles north of Fannet Head, and the lifeboats went out. It was so powerful to see that one of the crew actually was injured on board and was tended by Jason and the gang. And each one of them then got an award for that. And the lifeboat crew each got a Chief Executive's Commendation from the RNLI, and you can see the overall one there. You see Jason just there on the left. So fantastic. So again, and I'm getting towards the end, don't worry, because this is probably the pièce de résistance. This, you've probably seen this on Saving Lives at Sea, but this was Port Stewart Headland Rescue in 2020. So I'll let that run. Now, there are very few times when film work does justice to the conditions that a lifeboat goes out in, and that one absolutely does justice. And a life was very, very definitely saved that day. And that was the third time that a lifeboat mechanic has left the lifeboat to rescue somebody while still in charge of the engines. A tradition started by Derek, continued by Anthony, and continued then by Anthony's replacement, David Robinson. So quite something. This is the last slide, unfortunately, and maybe fortunately for yourselves. You've had to listen to me, but in the 100 years that the Chambers family have been involved with the Portrush Lifeboat, many changes have taken place. In 1924, Carl Chambers was responsible for the maintenance of an 80 horsepower petrol engine capable of 8 knots. The current lifeboat has two 1650 horsepower MTU diesel engines and is capable of 25 knots. The TBBH served for 25 years, including during the war, and went out 78 times and saved 17 lives. The Richard Evans saved 70 lives in the course of 316 services over 19 years, and in 1 day 4 day period was 25 hours at sea. But the one thing that hasn't changed is the dedication shown by all those connected with the RNLI, and to whom many individuals owe their lives. And I want to thank the Chambers family for their contribution to 100 years of life-saving in Portrush.
Thank you very much, Mark. Can we just give Mark and Robert a big round of applause? This was brilliant. It's very special to be able to mark 100 years of Chambers input into keeping all of us safe at sea by two such renowned people within the town. So thank you very much, and thank you to all the Chambers family for coming this evening. We do appreciate it.